Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Ringgold. Today I'm going to show a full-length tutorial on how to make these chamomile earrings, chamomile blossom earrings. Can you see them? There we go. For those of you who are not aware, I do provide much more detailed, in-depth tutorials on how to fabricate nature-inspired pieces out of sterling silver on my Patreon channel, which is a $25 per month subscription. And this month, I'm going to be showing you how to make this dahlia, which takes today's tutorial on how to fabricate chamomile about 10 more steps. So it's the same techniques, but 10 times more complicated, I suppose you could say. But if you're interested in that, check out my Patreon channel. You might be interested. As always, feel free to leave questions, comments below, and I will do my best to respond. Thank you again, and I hope you learned something today. You'll start with a disc cutter and 22 gauge sterling silver sheet. The size of the disc that you cut is your choice, but I'm going with the third one in this Durston, the third to the largest in this Durston. Inserting my sterling silver and putting a flange, copper flange on the other side to ensure that the circle I cut out is actually a circle and doesn't turn out to be a little bit lopsided. The discs or the circles that I'm cutting out are 2/3 of an inch in diameter. I use a heavy brass hammer for this process, and I do not anneal my silver until after I cut out the discs. If you don't have a disc cutter, you can simply saw out the circles and don't worry about sanding down the edges. You can deal with that later. When you have your two discs, you will want to anneal with a soft flame. I use a Little Smith oxygen propane torch. So using more propane in your flame is essential in order to anneal your silver. You can refer back to my Little Smith torch overview, which is a previous video tutorial that I offer on my YouTube channel. You'll know when your silver is annealed by when you pull away. This first time annealing, your silver will be dark. After annealing, place your pieces in the pickle, and in the meantime, you're going to take piles of sterling silver scrap. Ensure that there's no fine silver in there. If there's solder on your scrap, don't worry about that. Melt your scrap down into what I call buttons, where because you're fusing these scraps together on a surface, the bottom will be flat and the top will be rounded. Then you'll take your discs, and I usually just create a little cross so I know where the center is. Mark the center of the discs and the buttons that you created, the back side or the underside of the buttons, the flat side. You will be drilling a hole all the way through the discs that you cut out and partially into the back side of the buttons. You can use this chart to determine the drill bit size for 16 gauge wire. Your drill bit size is 1.6 to 1.8 millimeters. Of course, you can create a pilot hole if you prefer. That way, if you have trouble controlling your drill as you're drilling, it will prevent it from skidding across the surface. So now I'm taking approximately 2-inch length piece of 16 gauge wire, placed it into the hole that's only going partially into the back side of the button, the underside of the button. Fluxing it, I use Mighty Flux, and here I'm going to use hard solder to solder the wire into the hole. So you're going to start with hard solder, and then the idea is you will heat the entire piece, and when you see the piece has turned a slight yellow hue, turn your torch to the side. You're going to take the solder and sweat it to the wire just above the hole. Don't leave it as a ball. You want to see it puddle. And once it does that, you'll turn your torch back down to the mass. There's the puddle. Heat the mass, and the solder will drop down into the hole. Don't worry, I'm going to talk you through that again. Now you'll put the disc, make sure that it's nice and flush with the button. You don't want there to be a gap. I flux everything that my torch touches, so the bottom and the top. And this time, I'm stabilizing it again with my third hand. This time you're going to heat not just that top layer, but the bottom layer, the button. And you're going to use medium solder. And the same as before, I'll talk you through it. You're going to be heating the entire mass, not just that top layer. It's essential that you think about the whole mass in order for the solder to flow. And the more mass you add, the more flame or the more heat you're going to need coming out of that torch. So as you see, I'm heating that button, the bottom layer, most, because that's more mass than that top disc. Heating it, and when I see a gentle hue, turning my torch, sweating it to the wire. Now I'm heating the mass until the mass is hot enough and the solder will flow down into the hole. It's important to pay attention to colors as you're heating your silver. The slight yellow hue that I keep referring to means easy solder flow point. The black means no more flux. So in these spots I'm pointing out, there's no more flux. The yellow spot there, that means there's still flux. Luckily I'm making 2 chamomile blossoms to show, so put the 16 gauge wire into the hole, flux everything that your torch touches, transitioning back to hard solder. Heat your solder, not your pick, to pick up that solder. And then you're going to heat the mass, heat that button. When you see the slight yellow hue, turn your torch at an angle, sweat the solder to the wire just above your hole, and then again heat the mass, the button, until the button is hot enough and the solder is going to say, oh my gosh, I want to be down there. And it will drop down into the hole. Add the disc, flux everything, top, bottom. Now you can move to medium solder. And again, I'm going to be heating the entire piece, not just that upper layer. Heating the entire piece. The bottom, the button, is more mass than that disc, so I'm going to be primarily heating that disc. And then when I can see that slight yellow hue, which means easy solder flow point, I'm going to come up to the wire, sweat the solder to the wire just above the hole. When it sweats, when it puddles, heat the mass. There, what happened was that I hadn't heated the mass enough so that the solder wasn't yet ready to even adhere to the wire. So I have to go back and focus on heating the mass, and when it's hot enough, it will adhere to the wire. Once it does, turn my torch back down, heat the top, the bottom, until the solder, remember, solder follows heat, drops down into the hole. From here, you can pickle everything, quench, make sure it's nice and clean. Use flush gutters to snip off that 16 gauge wire. And next I use a straight edge stake. You can also use a screwdriver if you don't have something like this. And don't put it down on your surface, you're going to hover above it. I think of it like a sewing machine. You're going to hover above your metal, this is a hammer from Ace, lightweight hammer. And here, hopefully you can see, I'm going to hover above the silver, and it's the hammering that causes the stake to have contact with the silver, like a sewing machine. I'm hammering, and every single time I hammer the stake, it has contact and makes that texture in the silver. I'll probably go more in depth into this texturing technique in a future episode. And what you're doing is creating, I think of it as like rays of a sunshine. You're going all the way around your silver disc. The texture is fanning outward. And if you find that your attempt at creating this texture is difficult, you might want to anneal your silver. Do this until you've created this texture all the way around that button consistently. Next, you'll use ball burrs with your flex shaft. It really doesn't matter what size. I just use one that's a little bigger and one that's quite a bit smaller. Starting with the bigger one, digging into the button. Again, it might be easier if you anneal it before you begin going across the entire surface, including around the sides. Digging in, creating little notches all the way across the surface. Think of it as creating dimples across the surface. And I have found that if I anchor my hand on the table as I'm digging into the middle, I have better control over the process. And then transition over to the smaller burr. This one allows you to dig a little deeper into the metal, which creates an interesting texture with both surface level and deeper divots. And once again, if you find that the silver is being stubborn, then you may want to go back and anneal your silver. From here, you'll move on to sawing out the petals of your flower. I'm using a 3/0 saw blade for 22 gauge sterling silver sheet. Saw from the outside of the disc all the way into as close as you can, flush against that button. A reminder for those of you who are maybe new to sawing, you want to hold your saw frame like it's a bird. You're holding it by its neck. You do not want to kill the bird. Lighten your grip on the saw frame. You will find that once you lighten your grip, your tension will be released all the way from your hand up to your neck. Then you're going to move forward with your flex shaft. Here I'm going to use a cutoff wheel. I'm going to use this to taper the edges, or I suppose it's called beveling, the edges of all of the petals. And I'm doing this on the back side of the petals so that I'm not messing up the texture that is on the front side. These particular cutoff wheels are a bit more expensive, so if you prefer, you can use a separating disc. They're thicker and they work just as effectively, so don't worry about that. Then use a set of needle nose pliers to tweak the petals. From here, you can use a black silicone disc to soften the edges. Your burrs may have left tiny sharp spots. Use it along the edges of all of the petals, underneath anything that might be uncomfortable when worn. I'm sorry I haven't noted this earlier for those of you who are new to my channel, but all of the product codes are through Rio Grande. At this point, what I'm doing is taking 20 gauge wire, which is the ear wire, and I'm creating a decorative little spiral. This is absolutely your choice. You could just ball up the end of the wire or nothing at all. The point is, this is going to be soldered to the back side of the chamomile blossoms, and you really don't need to do anything besides have pieces of 20 gauge wire to move forward. Whatever you choose, you're going to take these and you're going to flux them. Again, this is Mighty Flux. And I've got easy solder here on my soldering platform. There's the E to show easy solder. I have found that for me, it's easiest to sweat solder the easy solder to the wire and then transition it to the mass, to your piece. Then you can heat the mass and not worry about the solder jumping all over the place. So in any case, I'm sweating the solder. Again, it's not just a ball. You have to heat the mass enough for the solder to puddle. If it's just balling on top, that means you're not heating the metal sufficiently. Now I'm fluxing everything that my torch touches. The front side, the back side of the chamomiles, and the 20 gauge wire. I'm turning the 20 gauge wire so that the solder that is sweated onto it is face down against the mass, against the chamomile blossoms. From here, I'm going to turn on my torch, and then I'm going to focus my torch, like I just said, on the mass rather than on the wire. You really want to avoid the wire with your torch because otherwise you're just going to burn through your wire. So be sure, as you can see, I'm heating that button underneath, a little bit on top, but I'm mostly focusing on the mass, the button underneath. I'm using my pick not only to protect that wire, but to hold it down against the mass so that when the solder's ready to flow, it's nice and flush. Once the solder flows, that's pretty much it. Put it in the pickle. Make sure it's nice and clean. I form the wire over an old pencil for the ear wire. And then from here, I do liver of sulfur, which I talk about in some of my other YouTube tutorials. This is a sunburst radial disc that I use to remove some of the liver of sulfur. Polish as you like. And that's it, folks. Please reach out if you have questions, comments. Let's hope that silver prices continue to plummet. Thank you. Have a great weekend.